On October 14th, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane flew a routine photographic pass over western Cuba, 13 miles above the ground, cameras running the entire time. 2 days later, photo analysts in Washington laid the developed images across a table and identified something that would bring the world closer to nuclear war than it has ever come before or since. Soviet medium-range ballistic missile sites under active construction 90 miles from the coast of Florida. This is the story of the 13 days that followed, and almost nobody involved knew, in the moment, whether they'd survive to see the end of them. To understand why those missiles were there at all, it helps to rewind about 18 months earlier. In April 1961, the United States had backed a failed invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, an attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro's government that collapsed within days and left Castro convinced, correctly, that Washington would try again. Castro turned to the Soviet Union for protection, and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw an opportunity that went well beyond simply defending an ally. The United States already had nuclear missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy, close enough to strike Moscow in a matter of minutes, an imbalance Khrushchev deeply resented. Placing Soviet missiles in Cuba would defend Castro, yes, but it would also, in one move, put American cities under the exact same kind of close-range threat the Soviet Union had been living under for years. It was as much a message about fairness in Khrushchev's mind as it was a military maneuver. President Kennedy was briefed on the morning of October 16th. Within hours, he'd assembled a small, secret group of his most trusted advisors, later known as ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. For the next 2 weeks, this group would meet daily, sometimes multiple times a day, arguing over options that range from doing nothing at all to a full-scale invasion of Cuba, knowing that miscalculating in either direction could end in nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union. The missiles themselves weren't a surprise in the abstract. Everyone in the room understood the Soviets had nuclear weapons capable of reaching the United States already, launched from Soviet soil. What made Cuba different was distance and time. A missile launched from Cuba could reach Washington, D.C. in roughly 13 minutes, compared to the half hour or more of warning a launch from the Soviet Union would provide. 13 minutes wasn't just a shorter number, it was potentially the difference between a president having time to respond and a president having no time at all. ExComm split almost immediately into two camps. One group, led by military voices, pushed hard for immediate airstrikes to destroy the missile sites before they became operational, followed by a full invasion of Cuba. The other group, including Kennedy's brother and Attorney General Robert Kennedy, argued that a surprise attack on Cuba would be remembered as a modern Pearl Harbor, and worse, could trigger an immediate Soviet military response somewhere else in the world, most likely Berlin, where the U.S. had far weaker defensive footing. Days of debate produced a third option: not attack, not surrender, but a naval blockade around Cuba, deliberately relabeled a quarantine in every official statement, because a blockade is legally recognized as an act of war, and a quarantine technically is not. On October 22nd, Kennedy addressed the American public directly on live television, revealing the missile sites publicly for the first time and announcing the quarantine. For most Americans watching that broadcast, it was the first they'd heard that nuclear missiles were being installed within reach of nearly every major city on the East Coast. Grocery stores reported shoppers stockpiling canned goods within hours. School children practiced duck and cover drills with a seriousness that hadn't existed the week before. This wasn't hypothetical Cold War anxiety anymore. It had a specific location, a specific countdown, and a specific date the quarantine would take effect. The public reaction to Kennedy's broadcast went well beyond canned goods and drills. Civil defense offices across the country fielded a flood of calls asking about bomb shelter locations. Some families genuinely began stocking basements with food and water for an extended stay underground. College campuses held all-night vigils. It's difficult now, decades removed, to fully convey what it felt like to be a civilian in October 1962 with no security clearance and no way to know more than what the president chose to say on television, only that the country everyone lived in might, within days, no longer exist in a recognizable form. Fear like that doesn't show up cleanly in a history textbook timeline. It showed up in stockpiled pantries and kids who still remember 60 years later exactly what it felt like practicing to hide under a school desk from something a desk could never actually stop. The quarantine line went active on October 24th, a ring of U.S. Navy ships positioned to intercept and inspect any vessel suspected of carrying additional missile equipment toward Cuba. Soviet cargo ships, already en route across the Atlantic, kept coming, and for several hours nobody in Washington knew whether those ships intended to stop or attempt to run the line outright. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, watching intelligence reports of the Soviet ships slowing and turning back rather than testing the blockade, reportedly said, "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." It was one of the only moments of relief in 2 weeks that offered almost none, because even as the ships turned back, the missile sites already on Cuban soil kept getting closer to operational readiness, and back-channel negotiations between Washington and Moscow remained tense, slow, and frequently contradictory. Then came October 27th, remembered afterward simply as Black Saturday, the single most dangerous day of the entire crisis. A U.S. reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, killing the pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, the only combat casualty of the entire confrontation. Kennedy had, before the crisis began, privately indicated that the loss of a U-2 pilot would very likely mean war. ExComm spent that day debating retaliation, while, unknown to almost everyone in that room at the time, an entirely separate crisis was unfolding underwater that could have ended everything before Washington ever issued a response at all. A Soviet submarine B-59 had been operating near the quarantine line, cut off from communication with Moscow for days, its crew unaware whether war had already begun above the surface. American ships, trying to force the submarine to surface for identification, began dropping practice depth charges nearby, explosive enough to be felt clearly inside the hull, but not intended to sink the vessel. The submarine's crew, exhausted, overheated, and completely isolated from any actual information about what was happening in the world above them, interpreted the depth charges as the possible start of war. The submarine was carrying a nuclear-tipped torpedo, and under standing orders, launching it required agreement from 3 senior officers aboard. 2 agreed immediately. The third, an officer named Vasily Arkhipov, refused. His refusal alone is credited by historians as likely preventing a nuclear detonation that would have made the rest of the crisis irrelevant, decided not in the White House or the Kremlin, but in a single disagreement inside an overheated submarine hull nobody in Washington even knew was there. By the next day, October 28th, a resolution had finally taken shape, negotiated partly through open diplomatic channels and partly through secret back-channel talks between Robert Kennedy and the Soviet ambassador. The public agreement: the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba, verified by UN inspection, in exchange for a public U.S. pledge not to invade the island. The private, unpublicized half of the deal, kept secret for decades afterward. The United States would quietly remove its own Jupiter missiles from Turkey, close to the Soviet border, within several months, provided the arrangement was never officially acknowledged as a trade. Both sides needed to look like they hadn't blinked, even as both sides were in fact blinking simultaneously. 13 days, start to resolution, and for most of it, the people making the decisions had no way of knowing whether they were successfully de-escalating a crisis or one miscalculation away from a war neither side could survive. What actually ended, it wasn't a decisive military victory or a dramatic surrender. It was 2 governments operating on incomplete information and immense pressure, finding just enough room to let each other stand down without either one publicly losing. And it was, in at least one recorded case, a single naval officer under the ocean, refusing to agree to a launch nobody above the surface even knew was being debated. The crisis left a permanent mark on how both superpowers handled each other afterward. Within a year, a direct telephone link, later called the Moscow-Washington Hotline, was installed specifically because both governments realized how much of the previous 2 weeks had been spent waiting hours for messages to be encoded, transmitted, and decoded. Precious time that could have made the difference between a resolved standoff and a catastrophic miscalculation. The following year also produced the Limited Test Ban Treaty, the first arms control agreement of the entire Cold War, signed by leaders who had just spent 13 days staring at the closest possible version of the alternative. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains the closest documented moment the world has come to full nuclear war, not because either side wanted it, but because it demonstrated exactly how little control anyone truly has once a crisis reaches that altitude, dependent not just on presidents and premiers, but on ship captains reading depth charges correctly, pilots not being shot down, and one submarine officer choosing to say no.